Okay, I think we can start. We have quite a number of participants. So I would like to welcome everyone to the panel discussion of the Lost Millennials project. My name is Celine and I represent the Fere Research Institute, who is the lead partner of the Lost Millennials project, as well as our transnational partnership. And as this is our first online event from this event series, I would like to briefly say a few words about the project itself. So Lost Millennials is a research project funded by the Fund for Youth Employment of the EEA Norway grants. And it was launched only a couple of months ago with a consortium of 13 partners from 13 countries from across Europe. So we have a very diverse group of partners. And the main aim of our project is to contribute to the successful integration of young people aged 25-29 who are not in employment or education and training to the labor market. And we aim to do this through three main types of activities. We will have our research activities, which are focusing on this group of older NEETs who are only coming into the spotlight of research and policy recently. And we aim to examine their specific situation, the policies, as well as various labor market initiatives and intervention which address this group in the partner countries. And finally, we will carry out evaluations of governmental or community-based initiatives targeting this group in each of our beneficiary partner countries. We have already started on these tasks, but as I mentioned, we are at the very beginning of our project, so the results are yet to come. The second is that we aim to contribute to evidence-based policymaking and improving the evaluation of labor market initiatives and programs. And this is why we'll have a number of stakeholder engagement events and we'll develop policy recommendations based on our research results. These will come mostly towards the end of our project. And third, we are building a transnational research network, both within and outside the consortium, where we aim to engage in sharing know-how and good practices, build a capacity of researchers, evaluators, and experts in this field. And this is where this event also comes in, and that this is why I'm also very happy to see that there are a lot of interested participants at this event, and I'm sure that we will learn a lot from all the examples and the discussion. So shortly about the project, that's it. If you'd like to learn more about the project, please follow our social media pages, and our website will also be up and running shortly. And we will make sure to keep you updated on the results and the upcoming events of the project. So now I would like to give the floor to Tomasz Gajderowicz, representing our project partner from the Evidence Institute Foundation, and who will be moderating today's discussion. Thank you so much and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Esther, for this brief introduction of our project. So when we think of policies that are going to target the generation of lost millennials, there is always one big challenge, the methodological challenge in evaluation policies, in answering the question on what really works and what doesn't work. So in general, across the number of evaluations that were done, only some of them are really meaningful. And today we have the webinar that will give overview for the most important evaluations worldwide and identify methodological challenges that we face when we think of answering the questions on what really works and what are the evidence-based policies in the labor market, especially targeting youth. So today we have four world-known speakers that will share their unique experience in the field of evaluation of youths and NEETs and groups on the labor market. So today the presentation will be started by Márton from the Budapest Institute for Policy Analysis, then Celine from World Bank, then Miroslav Štefánik from Slovak Business Agency, and last but not least, Maciej Jakubowski from the Evidence Institute Foundation. So I will, of course, introduce all speakers between the presentations. So let's start with Márton, the senior researcher at Budapest Institute for Policy Analysis. Márton is extremely experienced researcher in the field of assessment of costs and benefits of employment policies in long-term unemployment. He focuses on econometric and microeconometric analysis of labor supply responses of individuals with health problems, vulnerable groups, and also he is very experienced in quantitative impact evaluation of complex employment and social policies for disadvantaged and new job seekers. Márton holds PhD from the Toulouse School of Economics and worked in most prominent European universities such as Leuven, Maastricht, University College London, and so on. So Márton will share the overview of the most important challenges in the evaluation of projects in our field, and then share some of his case study experiences from the evaluation. So Márton, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for inviting me. Let me share my screen with everybody. Let me do that. Just a minute. Sorry about that. Here we go. And right. So thank you very much for having me. I hope that everybody can see my slides correctly. So what I will do is I'll introduce a piece of paper which was written in a very similar project to what is now starting the Lost Millennials project. Our project was entitled, I'll try to, sorry about that. Yeah, so our project was entitled Youth Employment Partnership. And basically, there were 4 countries or 4 research institutes from 4 countries involved as beneficiaries from Spain, Hungary, Italy, and Poland. So the main objective was to have counterfactual impact evaluations of active labor market policy programs targeted at youth. And in some cases, we also performed some pilots of outreach to young people. And of course, the main objective was also not only to have evaluations, but also to offer some guidance to those people who would like to do evidence-based policy making. And so I'd like to call attention to some of our research outputs and specifically to our so-called methodological guide, which is up on the webpage of the project, and I'll introduce some of the flavors of that guide to you right now. Obviously, we also have evaluations from all the 4 countries, but I'm not going to talk about those in depth today. I'll just have some small little examples here and there. Okay, so that's what we'll do. So first of all, what is this methodological guide about? It covers basically 3 or 4 major issues. The first one, because in our project we used administrative data, this guide or methodological note was about how to use and access administrative data. I'll talk a little bit about that today. Then we had a section which is about the process of evaluating a labor market or social policies. And I'll talk mostly about the issue of choice of counterfactual evaluation method today or right now. And last but not least, we also had a brief section on how to present results that come from a counterfactual impact evaluation to policymakers. What are the issues and main points there? Okay, so let me jump right into this. First, I'll talk about administrative data. So, what are the advantages of administrative data? As you might know, very often the main advantage of administrative data is that you have huge sample sizes. In many cases, this means the whole population or all the participants of a given employment program. Usually, this data have high reliability, and usually these data do not suffer from biases related to self-reporting that can occur in surveys such as recall bias, etc., etc. And last, but this is, I think, the most important point, is that with using the right techniques, administrative data sets can be linked across each other if, I'll talk about this very briefly in a minute, if in this country's data protection regulation allows that, okay? And then what am I talking about? Linking different administrative data sources. What are the typical data sources? First of all, typically this is social security data. Social security data about employment relationships and different ways of getting access to health or health insurance or pension contributions. Then data, obviously, from the public employment services about enrollment into different employment programs and so on and so forth. Then the third type of data that typically researchers have access to is tax authority databases. This could mean also income statements of individuals, or it could be profit and loss or balance sheets of firms which employ individuals. And we also have different kinds of employer databases that researchers who are typically interested in employer outcomes can use. So those are the types of data that an individual or a researcher could think about linking together and using for evaluations. Now, obviously, the challenges with administrative data are also numerous. The first one is, does this kind of data at the country level exist? Just a short remark, as far as I know, in Poland, for example, and also in Italy, up until 5 years ago, each of the individual regions of Poland and Italy, they had the public employment service data collected at the region level, but as far as I'm aware, these data sets were not collected at the country level. So you could only do analysis of each individual region of Italy and Poland. Right, so does it exist? Well, hopefully it does. Then obviously the second main obstacle, and this is often a very thorny issue, is how to get access to the data. So does the country have a formal procedure whereby researchers can apply to use this administrative data, and how many different data sets can be linked together via individual unique IDs, and what are the legal ramifications around that? Okay. Now, hopefully you can link some data sets. Then the main issue is, when going a step closer to evaluating labor market programs, is how can you identify program participants, and do we have the same level of information about participants, those individuals who actually enroll in the programs, and vis-a-vis those kinds of people who are very similar or typically eligible for these kinds of programs, but did not participate in the program. There are a number of occasions where the level and the depth of information among these two groups is not the same, and this will cause problems when evaluating the data, when evaluating the programs, right? And then last but not least, do we, in the data sets that we have access to, is the background information, for example, on the family status of the individual and so on and so forth. So is our data rich enough to enable us to control for many different kinds of confounding factors, right? Okay, so those are the main challenges of administrative data. Let me check whether there are questions. There's no questions so far. And then let me go a little bit into the challenges or the steps of choosing what a counterfactual impact evaluation is all about and how to think about choosing methods, right? So the main idea in this counterfactual impact evaluation is to think about what would have happened to individuals who participated in a given program had they not participated in this program, or in the complete absence of this program. These two questions are not exactly the same, but right now I'll use these two as synonyms, right? So what would have happened to these individuals if they did not participate in this program? And of course, you cannot, typically you cannot do that. You cannot observe what would have happened. Hence, the evaluator or the econometrician has to figure out some way how to infer what would have happened to the individuals, right? But the main issue is that typically participants in the program differ in their observed or unobserved, at least unobserved to the analyst or the statistician. So the participants and the non-participants typically differ across a number of characteristics. And the fact that the two groups differ across a number of characteristics can lead to what is called by econometricians or labor economists selection or sample selectivity bias. There's two ways in which why this might cause problems. The first one is that there is some kind of baseline difference across the two groups, and the outcomes of the two groups are different even without the policy, right? So there's selection based on typically time invariant characteristics. The second is when there is selection based on the expected impact of the program. So typically, a given employment program is not does not have the same impact for all groups or all individuals. And typically, what we would expect is that policymakers or the individuals themselves select into programs which they assume is the most beneficial for them. And this is a second issue with respect to selectivity, right? So this is the type of issue that we have to deal with, selective enrollment into the program. Okay, and so how to go about choosing an identification strategy, or how to go about trying to infer what would have been the counterfactual outcome of those who participate in the program. Well, the first question you have to ask yourself is whether allocation or enrollment into the program is, whether it is randomized. Most often than not, it is not, but there are some very exceptional cases, for example, in pilot programs where enrollment is randomized, and hence in those cases one can use all the methods that are available for randomized controlled trials, right? But most often than not, in an actual program, not a pilot, there's no randomization whatsoever. And then one will have to employ a so-called quasi-experimental program. And when one employs a quasi-experimental program, then the main question is whether there is an enrollment rule into this program which creates a very specific cutoff. For example, there's a variation in enrollment into the program, which is based on, say, age or region of residence, and so on and so forth. When this is the case, so when there are such rules that determine participation in the program, we have some statistical methods that use this kind of enrollment procedure or take advantage of this kind of enrollment procedure, such as regression discontinuity methods, difference in difference methods, or instrumental variable methods. The main idea behind those kinds of methods is always the same, that there is the treatment group who actually participated in the program, and then there's the control group who are very similar in most relevant characteristics, but who have a much lower probability or propensity to participate in the program, and such as say they're slightly older or slightly younger, hence they cannot, or typically they should not be allowed to participate in the program, right? So that's one way to go. When you do not have that kind of enrollment procedure, these very clear-cut, or at least at first sight, clear-cut enrollment rules, then one will have to use some alternative method. Typically, these alternative methods try to account for all observed and hopefully unobserved differences between participants and non-participants. So then the main question is whether in the data set which the researcher has at hand, do we have a large enough set of control variables or a rich set of background variables with which we can ensure that the treatment group and the control group are as similar as possible. If you don't have good enough data, then go and find better data. But if you do have data which is good enough, then there are some kind of statistical procedures that the researcher can apply, such as matching or control function methods, to try to get at the treatment effect, or in other words, to reconstruct what would have been the outcomes of the participants in the absence of enrollment into this program. So that's the identification strategy in a nutshell. And in our little methodological guide, we have some very specific examples from our 4 countries about youth programs. I'll put a few things up on the board right now, very quickly. The first one is that I'll contrast in this slide a little bit Hungary and Poland. In Hungary, there is we have the advantageous situation where in one of the large research centers in Hungary, in Budapest, we have a data bank who are very active in trying to link different administrative data sources. Hence, researchers in Hungary can have access to a 50% random sample of the adult population of Hungary, and very many different data sets are linked together, starting from social security through also health data and public employment service data, and so on and so forth. So we are in the fortunate situation of having a relatively long time series at this point in stage, 15 years time series of 50% of the adult population. We know quite a bit about them based on linked administrative data. The situation, as I already hinted to previously in Poland, as far as I am aware, is not so good. As far as I'm aware, as of 2020 or 2021, the Public Employment Service data sets cannot be linked with Social Security data sets. Why is this an issue? It's typically an issue because when one is thinking about what should be the outcome that we measure, typically for an employment program, it is whether an individual is employed, what are their earnings, and how, let's say, how stable their employment situation is. Now, when you cannot link public employment service data with Social Security data, typically the only thing that you can observe is whether the individual has left the Public Employment Service Register records, and maybe you have some information about the employment status of the former program participants, but typically you don't know much about the those persons who did not enroll. Okay, so I wanted to highlight that and two examples of something that is very rich as opposed to something that is not very rich in terms of administrative data set. And then I'd like to highlight a few points which are specifically related to evaluating programs for young people, and more specifically evaluating programs which are in the so-called youth guarantee, right? So first issue is, okay, do the programs, so the programs which are part of the youth guarantee, does it make sense to evaluate these programs one by one, or the researcher has to think about the youth guarantee and all the different services and programs within the youth guarantee as a complete package? Okay, so that's a typical important issue. Depends on the country context for most of the time. I mean, I come from an Eastern European perspective, where unfortunately these programs and services are not so rich. Hence, one can think about actually evaluating programs one by one. The second is that in principle, most of the time, there is a very clear cutoff for these youth guarantee programs. Used to be 25, now it's going to be 30 years old. But most of them than not, when you go closer and take a look at the regulation, it turns out that very often the same kinds of programs are available for older individuals who are not eligible for the youth guarantee. And then, of course, this will create an issue because the cutoff is not as strict or as you would imagine or as you would wish. Okay, then if you don't have these kinds of age-related differences, you could think about using regional implementation differences. And again, one might think that you hit the jackpot right there, because there's some less developed regions which are eligible for funding under the Youth Employment Initiative. But most often than not, the exactly same kind of programs are implemented in the not so disadvantaged regions. The only thing that might differ across the more disadvantaged and less disadvantaged regions is maybe the intensity with which the program is administered, or in other words, how many young individuals enroll in the program, or there might be some kind of staggered implementation across these regions. But unfortunately, these raise very important issues in thinking about what kind of impacts you can actually evaluate. And last but not least, when you think about not using these kinds of regional age cutoffs, then one might think about, okay, but where do I find a good control group if they come from the same age category and the same region, when in principle, all young NEETs who go and seek the services of the Youth Guarantee Administration, and typically the Public Employment Services, everybody is eligible for the same program. Then the issue is, why did this individual choose to not participate in any programs or any programs and services, and how does the selection occur in these kinds of programs? So those were the points that I wanted to highlight, and thank you very much. I hope we're not very much behind time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Márton, and thank you for mentioning Poland. Yes, indeed, we have this issue with merging data from different administrative registers, and also within the register, there are some issues that make the data hardly accessible. Maciej will say more about it in the last presentation. And also now I will introduce Celine Fere, who I met in one of the World Bank projects actually related to the administrative data in Poland. Celine Fere is the development economist. She's extremely experienced in number of United Nations agencies as the international consultant. She worked for the World Bank, UNDP, UNICEF, ILO. The list is very, very long. She is economist. She worked as economist in the social protection unit. She holds PhD from University of California, Berkeley, and now she's focusing on labor market and social policies related to the just transition and transition towards a low carbon economy, where she's focusing now on the programs that are aimed at retraining, upskilling, and making the workforce that exists in the region more ready for this transition. So Celine, please share with us your experience in the field of evaluation of youth. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tomasz. So let me try to share my screen. I think this is good. Do you have the full screen right now? Yes? Okay, excellent. So thanks, Tomasz. I think that, you know, what you asked me to talk about was the difficulties in evaluating the impact of any kind of active labor market program on youth. And I try to think about it not only as, you know, what are the difficulties in evaluating active labor market programs in general, but why is it more difficult to evaluate it when you're thinking about youth rather than people in general, right? And so what I try to do is that I try to think about it, with two different types of information that I can share with you. One that is rather generic, about different programs targeted at youth, and another one that looks into a very specific program that faced difficulties in being evaluated in France by JPAL in 2014. So first of all, one of the difficulties that we have, or that, you know, the international community faces when thinking about evaluating youth programs is basically that it is very difficult to compare initiatives and to draw conclusions from programs that can somehow be named the same, but actually do very different things with very different populations. So to my knowledge, there are two meta-analyses on the impact of ALMPs on youth, one that was carried out by Staneva in 2015 and another one by Kluver in 2014. And what they say is that there's not much evidence on whether or not these active labor market programs managed to bring youth back on the labor market, you know? And the reason why we see little evidence, little of the impact of ALMPs can be attributed to different factors. The first one is that in general, the timeline that researchers have to evaluate these programs is very short. And you need longer term perspective to see an impact either on the probability of being employed or on, let's say, income. The second is also that these evaluations are very complicated because of attrition. So initially you have people that participate in the program, and then some of them drop out of the program, or as a researcher, it's not so much that they drop out of the program, it's also that they just do not respond anymore to the survey. And so you don't have any more information on them. As mentioned before, it's quite difficult to compare and draw conclusions from interventions that are quite different in nature. And finally, the difficulties in evaluating youth labor market program is that there are often confounding factors that can actually influence why you do have success or you do have failure. So for instance, very often in recession times, you do see youth properly evaluated with counterfactual, properly evaluated programs that do show like a large impact on youth, but it's usually because the situation is so bad that there is a lot of margin for improvement, and that's the reason why you see an impact, right? So let me actually have, let me actually show you a slide with quite a few programs that were implemented in Latin America focusing on youth. And I'm just going to focus on 3 different items. The first one, and it is the column that is, let's say, highlighted in orange to the left, is that when you talk about youth unemployment or like targeting the youth, every country has a different way of looking at the population that they're interested in. Argentina, 15 to 24 years old. If you look at Peru, for instance, at the very bottom, they start at 14 to 24 years old. So there are different groups that are included. So when you're thinking about, sharing conclusions about whether or not these programs are working, you're not talking about the same people. What you also see is that, and that's really that sort of relates to a comment that I just made before, is that they don't start with the same, let's say, unemployment situations, right? If you look at Argentina, when the program Proyecto Joven was evaluated, 1 in 3 youth was unemployed, right? So the probability of making a difference is quite high. On the other hand, if you look at Mexico, when they were implementing Probeca, the unemployment rates were much lower, right? The second is, and that's related to other types of programs with not necessarily youth, but other labor market programs, is do we manage to get, for instance, baseline data? And you can see that in the case of Mexico and Panama, and this is what is highlighted in green. There was no information for the baseline of the survey. So in one case, it was reconstructed ex post. In the other case, it was reconstructed by asking people retrospective questions, but thinking about the presentation we just had by Márton, these are not ideal ways of evaluating programs. And finally, this comes back to the comment I made before, the timeline. So the column that you see in yellow. Most often, when evaluating labor market programs, the timeline is not that long. So think about, for instance, Panama, where the program was evaluated between 9 and 20 months after it was started. So if you're thinking about programs that are providing skilling, reskilling, on-the-job training, these need to last quite some time before the youth can actually start his job. And then you need some time to realize whether or not this young person will be properly integrated and will continue working, right? So the timeline is not that long. So this is just a way of showing you in general what are the kind of difficulties that you can face. But let me go into a very specific example, which was studied by JPAL. It was an evaluation that was led by Bruno Crépon on an initiative that the Public Employment Services launched in 2007. What they realized is that in disadvantaged neighborhoods, young people were incurring very high unemployment rates, and they had very little preparation to know how to set up their own business. And so what they decided to do, they decided to implement a program that lasted 2 years between 2009 and 2011 in these neighborhoods for unemployed youth, and that was providing collective training, tutors, support in setting up your business, finding financing, etc. And what they did is that they did this randomized control trial by which 970 youth got the program, and 475 just got the regular type of initiatives that public employment services in France can give. And what they did is that they did 2 rounds of survey, one 16 months after and another one 28 months after, which is quite a lot of time later. And the biggest issue that they faced was to manage to reach out to people that participated in the program. So first of all, and this is something that not all programs can afford to do, for the entire time of the evaluation, they had a full-time phone operator that was trying to reach out to the, let's say, 1,500 participants. What they had to do is that they also had a very hard time reaching out to people. And so they had to put in place this, I would say, fantastic data collection to cross-check how to reach out to people, right? So they had, when they registered people, they had, full information about email, phone, address, etc. But then they cross-checked that, very often when you fill in manually this information, you make mistakes. So they cross-checked with the administrative data from the PES that, everything was correct. Then in addition to that, throughout the experiment, to try to, contact those people that were not answering emails, that were not answering proper letters, that were not answering phone calls, they also tried to find additional information through specialized sites or social networks, trying to contact people through Facebook, Viadeo, etc. Right? And still, it was quite complicated. So what they had to do is to make sure that people would indeed participate in the 2 rounds of survey. They tried, positive reinforcement, sending letters to those who participate to tell them how important it was that they participated in the survey, and also to make sure that they had the proper coordinates for the second round of the survey. Now, what is quite interesting is that they still had a lot of people that did not answer the survey. And what they put in practice, and of course, because they are researchers from JPAL and they love randomization, they thought about also evaluating which of these different ways of, increasing participation worked the best. And so during the first round of the survey, out of all the people that did not answer the survey, what they did is that they randomly chose 3 ways of trying to increase participation. The first one was to send a letter only to those who did not participate and remind them that it's really important to participate. The second one was a letter with a 15 euro voucher. And the third one was a letter with a 30 euro voucher. And what you can see on the screen is that, just sending the letter did increase the propensity to answer by 18%, but the 15 euro voucher increased it by 24% and the 30 euro voucher by 32%, right? And so what they had in the end was that they managed to reach out to 70% of the participants. Right. Now, that was only 16 months later. And you imagine that 28 months later, it was even more difficult to reach out to the participants. So what they did before they even implemented the second round of the survey is that they said, okay, what we're going to do is that we're going to divide our participants into 2 groups. There's going to be the group that is not so difficult to reach, and we do the normal, we just, try to reach out to them through email, phone calls, or letters. And we're also going to identify ahead of time a group that is difficult to reach. So we know that so far, more than 5 times they didn't answer our phone calls, or they gave us a fake number. And from the start, before we even start thinking about the second round, we're going to send them a 50 euro voucher, reminding them that, you know, if they participate in the survey, they can use it, right? And then there were still some people from the not difficult to reach group that didn't answer. And when they failed to answer, those were also sent a 50 euro voucher to increase participation. Now, there were still people that did not participate. And the phone operator that we mentioned before was very dedicated and tried to, and you know, thought maybe if I show up in person on the doorstep of these people, you know, I'm going to increase participation. So what they did is that they selected 35 people that were not living too far from when that person, where that person was based. Out of these people, they missed the ones that were the most, they listed the ones that were most difficult to reach out to. So people that had more than 20 missed calls, gave a fake number, never answered any email or letter. And they came out with a group of 35 people and they randomly selected 10. The operator showed up at their door with a 30 euro voucher to increase participation. And interestingly enough, even with that, all 10 young people refused to answer. So in the end, with that protocol in practice, only 58% of the participants were reached out during the second round of the survey. So that tells you that you basically, you know, lost within 28 months over 1/3 of the participants, right? So I think that what is really important from this evaluation that was carried out by Bruno Crépon is that you may be able to set up a proper impact evaluation with randomized control trial between the group that participate, the group that doesn't participate. You may be able at the same time to have, you know, good participation throughout the implementation of the project with the labor office. But maybe one of the biggest problems that you're going to face is that as a researcher, you're not going to be able to reach out to them. And this experiment shows you how, to what extent the researchers had to go in order to secure participation of the different participants. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Celine, so much. This was very practical, and it really shows how difficult are experiments in regards to use, and how difficult it is to really target and answer the questions that we have. So now let me just ask you to ask questions during the presentations using the Q&A chat. And I will introduce now the third speaker, who is Miroslav Štefánik. He is an expert in impact evaluation in the field of both education and employment policies. He worked a lot in processing the administrative data to produce policy relevant information, and he's author of many labor market reports. He is also a specialist in the graduate tracking methodology, which is also a very difficult issue in terms of how to really map and track people and their educational and professional paths. So he is also experienced in building micro simulation model for supply of labor and processing some additional external online data to answer labor market questions. So let me introduce Miroslav. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the floor. Hello, everyone. And thank you for the introduction, as well as having the chance to present here. I will share my slides, which are here. Okay. Good. So now you see my slides, right? The first slide, great. Okay, so unlike the previous speakers, I'm going to talk about one particular evaluation, although our aim was to generalize a bit. So our aim was to answer also the question about what works, but instead of looking for, try to generalize from some kind of a meta-analysis, we are trying to describe one particular case study in a more complex way. And also why I picked this presentation is that this is an example of how some of the very recently developed estimators can help you to paint your picture in a complete way. That's why we titled our presentation to take a complete picture of your youth guarantee, because that's what is enabled by the estimator we are applying in this case. Also, a small remark, I'm not affiliated with the Slovak Business Agency at all. I'm affiliated with the Slovak Academy of Sciences, and I accepted this invitation also because we have just recently launched a project in the same call, which is called Intercept. It's also supported by the Norwegian grants, but this particular research was developed under the nationally funded project by the Slovak Research and Development Agency. And this is a joint work with my co-authors, Sonia and Lukáš Lafers. Okay, very briefly about the motivation. As we all probably are familiar with the fact that the youth guarantee has increased the accessibility of active labor market policies to young people throughout the Europe, but especially in the case of Eastern European countries, this shift was even more pronounced, basically because a substantial share of the funding supporting the ALMPs comes from the European Social Fund. So as the EU level decision was made to orient this funding more towards the youngsters in the Eastern European countries, this has even more intensively supported the access of youngsters or young job seekers to active labor market policies. This is not, I mean, this is quite fine, but this is a bit in contrast with the available evidence, which is in some cases pointing towards ambivalent impact of this type of support provided to young job seekers, but also there is quite solid evidence about what the literature is calling the foot in the door effect, which is actually channeled through compensating for the lack of workplace experience. So all the programs facilitating or compensating for the lack of workplace experience seems to have positive impact, at least on the employment chances of youth. And we are curious about how this works in the case of Slovak active labor market policies. What we are doing, we are trying to take the complete picture. That's why we had to classify our programs, and we are focusing on programs which were in operation in 2017. And we classified all the programs into 4 groups. The first group we call the employment incentives. This is sheltering the programs which are quite expensive, actually the most expensive, because they basically work as that they are covering up to 75% of labor cost if most dominantly private sector employer decides to employ a young job seeker from the PES register. Then we have the support to graduate work experience, or the graduate practice, which was the only or the first original youth-oriented program in Slovakia, which is in operation since 2004. That's basically doing the same. It's compensating also for the lack of workplace experience, but the financial support paid to that program is much lower. It's like maybe 1/10 of the financial support paid through the employment incentives. Then we have training the third group, or the third class of programs is trainings. In the case of Slovakia, trainings provided to unemployed are mostly or dominantly short-term trainings. The interesting thing is that the training specialization can be picked by the job seeker job seekers themselves. And then in this class of trainings, we are mixing together vocational training with soft skill training. And then finally, the subsidized employment in public sector is the, let's say, public works or community service type of measures. So there are 2 programs over there facilitating this type of support. This is a flow chart of registered unemployed, the cohort of inflow cohort into registered unemployment in 2017. And those are cases who were unemployed for at least 6 months and took some ALMP participation during these first 6 months of their unemployment spell. And then we can see the proportions or the size of these inflows from the registration in the first column, and then the classified ALMP programs inflow into the particular ALMP programs during the first period here in the second column, and then during the second period, which is basically 7+ months in the very right column. And over here, we also are able to follow those individuals who went to employment or remained in unemployment even in the second half year of their after their registration. We estimate, or we do this analysis, perform the analysis on administrative data provided by Slovak Public Employment Service, which are unfortunately not linked to any social security database. So the only information we have about employment status is, as Márton was already describing this situation. So our only information is about the outcome of interest is based on the presence or absence in the register of unemployed persons. But we decided to track this 36 months after the start of the unemployment spell, because also because, for example, a recent meta-analysis of Kluve from Kluve and co-authors from 2019 concluded very clearly that it's the long-term period we should be looking for when evaluating the outcomes of youth-oriented ALMPs. Our data also include a lot of, quite rich. They're quite rich in terms of contextual information with individual socioeconomic characteristics, very rich unemployment history spanning through from 2007 to 2020, and then also a rich set of regional level characteristics, also some at the level of municipalities and then districts and various regional levels. How we define our sample. So as I was already mentioning, our sample is based on inflows to registered unemployment during 2017. Our age group is defined by the eligibility of the youth guarantee sheltered programs, which is 15 to 29 years old. And we restricted our sample also based on the length of their unemployment spell, dropping all the spells shorter than 3 months and dropping all the spells longer than 3 years. And we also, because of technical reasons, had to drop all the combinations of programs which had less than 50 observations of participants. I'm talking about sequences of programs because we are using this very fancy estimator, which was developed by Bodori and co-authors and published in 2020. And this is called the dynamic double machine learning estimator, which is based on the double machine learning estimator introduced by Czernozukov in 2018. And this is a very robust thing, and it enables us to follow not only participation in one program, but also sequences of programs, which is especially handy in the case of youth guarantee, where I was saying the availability of programs is quite large, and participants often flow from one program to another. Then we are also able, because of the features of the estimator, we are able to consider timing of the participation. So we divided the unemployment spell into, let's say, 2 periods. The first is first 6 months of unemployment spell, and the second period is everything after that. I'm sorry for the wording here in the slide, but the periods are basically up to 6 months and then 7+. And we also are able to consider alternative contrafactual situations. Because of the identification strategy is built like this, over here I'm going to present results for 2 contrafactual situations. The first is straight 12 months of unemployment, and the second contrafactual situation is 6 months in unemployment and then leaving the register in the subsequent period. Okay, and what we are estimating, the object of interest are the average treatment effects. So it's not the average treatment effect on the treated, but it's the treatment effect on the total population. And the estimator works in a inverse probability setup. So also the usual assumptions related to inverse probability weighting apply also in this case. Okay, this is the table with results for the first contrafactual situation. So these are the average treatment effects on the presence or absence in the register of unemployed people or unemployed persons 36 months after the participation in the employment. Yeah, so it's in relative time. The reading of the table would be, let's look at the first row of the table. This is basically the first column captures the treatment sequence. In this case, 0 and 1 is the treatment sequence. It's not really a treatment sequence, it's a sequence of statuses saying that this person was unemployed during the first 6 months and then left the register during the second period of interest. And we compare this situation to a contrafactual situation of 12 months straight or in unemployment. So the estimated absence from the register 36 months after their start of unemployment in this case would be 82%. So 82% of these particular individuals was absent from the register 36 months afterwards. And the sole fact that these persons found employment in the second period is linked to a 6% bonus in terms of absence from the register. Yeah, and this is statistically significant. And we had to do some trimming because, as I was mentioning, some of the the assumptions apply also here. The assumption of common support is applied. That's why we need to trim the sample to make it as homogeneous and to abide with the assumption of common support. And this is the proportion of trimmed observation is in the very last column here. The interesting findings start somewhere over here because the code 2, as we know, the unemployment status is coded by 0, employment is coded, or absence from the register is coded by 1, and then code 2 denotes the employment incentives, so the first program of interest. So the very expensive program of employment incentives covering 75% of the labor cost is associated with a 3% bonus in terms of absence from the register after 36 months. This if the participation happens later than 6 months. So we can see that this is the impact we are getting out of the very expensive program. What is interesting here is when we switch 2 and 0, and the participation happens in the first 6 months of the unemployment spell, we can see that the impact of the program actually increases substantially from 3% to 8%. So this is a quite nice evidence about in support of the early intervention concept, but this is only observable in the case of employment incentives programs. So when you are paying the employer in the public sector to employ your target group or your client. This is not observable in the case of training, for example. So training is coded by 4. If training happens in the second, after 6 months of unemployment spell, it still is improves the chances of being, let's say, improves the employment chances against the situation of 12 months long unemployment spell. It improves it by 3%. This is statistically significant. But if the training happens in the first 6 months of the unemployment spell, there is not such a clear bonus. Actually, the coefficient here is even smaller than in the case if training happens afterwards. But this is probably because of the different composition of the trainings provided earlier and later in the programs. But basically, the message is that early intervention is important, but clear evidence in supporting it is observable in the case of employment incentives programs, but it's not observable in the case of training programs in our particular case study from based on the Slovak data. Then we also can see that basically all the types of active labor market programs are working well when compared to the 12 months long unemployment period. Then we can switch to the second counterfactual situation, which is basically first 6 months in unemployment and then found a job 6 months afterwards, and that is basically copying the dilemma of a caseworker, or we try to answer questions of a particular caseworker which is considering a lock-in effect related to participating in a program. And these programs usually in Slovakia, I mean, I don't know for what the exact reason, but the usual duration of an active labor market policy program in Slovakia is 6 months. That's why we also decided to slice our periods like by 6 months here. So if I would be a caseworker, I would need to consider when sending someone to a program, I would need to consider what if he found a job actually by himself and he does not need the support. And if I would conclude that this particular person is very likely to find a job by himself within, or let's say in the period of 6 to 12 months, and then if I would be considering the impact of the support I'm providing against this counterfactual situation, then the evidence is not as clear. But there are still very interesting findings over here. What I really much like is that the training sequence, that means 2 short-term trainings in our case, for one happening in the first period and then the other one in the second, yields positive impact even against when compared to the situation of finding employment in the second half year of the unemployment spell. And then we also can see some other positive coefficients in the case of the graduate practice and also in the case of the very expensive employment incentives program. If this one, but the graduate practice has to be followed by employment in the second period, or followed right after the end of the program. Okay, so that were, I mean, a piece of our, let's say, an example of our findings, or the findings you can make out of an estimator, which allows you to take a complete picture of your youth guarantee, and which is able to capture sequences of treatments, and which is able to also consider dynamic participation, and then also able to make different counterfactual situation, or consider different counterfactual situations. Okay, I mean, I would probably end up here. I only have some references and a thank you note. So thank you for the floor.
Thank you so much, Miroslav. This was a great presentation. We are going into case studies and particular strategies to overcome the methodological issues. Thank you for that very much. And the fourth speaker, Maciej Jakubowski, will now present our joint work. Maciej Jakubowski is a former Deputy Minister of Education in Poland. He worked for OECD and several international agencies. Actually, his entire career is focused on searching for the hard evidence, and then he established the Evidence Institute Foundation, and the name of foundation is clearly about the best summary of his entire professional life. And he will show the randomized control trial, the only randomized control trial on a large sample we did together in Poland on using the administrative data ex post, which is quite the only of a type. So Maciej, the floor is yours. In the meantime, I would just ask participants and the audience to ask questions using the Q&A option. Maciej, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tomasz. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to Miroslav, Márton, and Celine for fantastic presentations. I think a lot of examples, a lot of details of the studies we already discussed, how to estimate causal effect of different active labor market policies, especially targeting the youth. So we know already it is very hard, and what we would like to present today is an example of randomized controlled trial which was conducted in Poland. And saying conducted is actually maybe not a good word in this case, because it was done by not by mistake, but it wasn't planned fully. I will explain that in the lead. It just happened. However, it is the only randomized controlled trial of active labor market policies, and the only one on the large scale really in public policy, except one other study of tax incentives by the World Bank in Poland. So the motivation for this work is pretty clear. We actually spend a lot of money on active labor market policies. In Poland, especially during the period of when we have a lot of money devoted to training active labor market policies, also from the European structural funds, it was really the time when people started refusing participation in training because it was just too much. And at the same time, we didn't have a single randomized controlled trial evaluation. And when you look at evaluations of different labor market programs, none of them use rigorous quasi-experimental approach. So none of them use really difference in differences or instrumental variables or regression discontinuity. So the evidence, however, we have hundreds of evaluation reports, but these reports are showing us in many cases associations within the data, or also in many cases opinions of people, or sometimes they basically confirm that the money was spent without serious attempt to evaluate the outcome of that. And another motivation for this work was that this actual policy with this intervention which we discussed was implemented in Poland for several years, but it was then decided not to continue by the ministry. And the report, which is a large report, it has, like, I would say, like 200, 300 pages, have no real attempt to evaluate the outcomes. It's mostly based on opinions, and it's mostly based on before and after comparisons, which we know can provide you a highly biased picture, especially when the labor market is changing rapidly, like in Poland. Also, what was the opportunity here was to use administrative data. We just saw example from Slovakia of extensive use of the administrative data. Márton was also discussing that, correctly pointing to some limitations in Poland. But here we worked together with the Labor Office, and they actually had this access to the data. Our work was to clean the data and make sense of them, which was not easy, but we had this access. So it's also an example when what can happen if you have this access to administrative data. Okay, so a big question here in this intervention is whether it's better to outsource active labor market policies to private entities rather than do it at home in by labor offices. There is some evidence that the private companies can be more flexible, more service oriented. They have stronger motivation to invest in cost saving. They can provide new services. On the other hand, there is also evidence that they will, whether in situations when you cannot closely monitor the outcomes or efforts, they might underinvest comparing to public entities. And overall, if you look at the literature, it's actually not a clear cut whether public or private services work better. And explanation is obvious. I mean, it really matters what is the service provided, and in this case, whether it's public or private, it's maybe important, but not as important as the quality of services provided. And that is indeed the case in our project. So we have the private entities, and they were giving the chance for good reasons. They have much more flexibility than labor offices. I mean, for labor offices, you have strict regulations, and sometimes it's also an explanation for not doing much. I mean, we can. This is regulated. This is already decided. But on the other hand, it's also true that for example, the basic portfolio of what they can provide is set up regulated by law. Private providers, of course, have more flexibility, and that was the idea of this project. It was to give them much more freedom than labor offices have. And then, of course, they also have incentives. I mean, in this case, the incentive was to have this project prolonged, have another contract for this project. So showing success was pretty important for them. For this intervention, the people who were unemployed for more than 12 months were targeted in a period of 2 years before the program, and they had to be in the profile 2 or 3. At that time, still labor offices were using this profiling tool in Poland. We focus on one voivodeship, Małopolskie, which is also an important part of this project, because they did a randomization. So as I said, we actually discovered that together with them, that they did a RCT when we were training them on impact evaluation methods together with the World Bank. And after, I think, 3 or 4 days of training, they came to us and say, we think we could have an RCT in our labor office. And we were pretty shocked. We couldn't believe that. But at the end, we found out that it's true. And the RCT was implemented because they wanted to randomize. They didn't want to to allow local labor offices to decide who will get help. So the only solution for them was to make it fair and to see really, intuitively whether it works or not. It was to randomize, and they were quite strict with randomization. So not planned, but a very good randomized controlled trial experiment. So here is a little what they could do, and basically the most important thing is that for the labor offices, local offices, they have this portfolio what they can do. They don't have time, they don't have resources to go into details. Here the difference with the private entities was that they were trying to go a different way. They were doing a lot of counseling, basically talking to these people, discussing, what they are looking at the labor market for, what are the competencies, and trying to explain them how they can find a way on the labor market, which in labor offices is of course possible, but usually you don't have time for that. And some counseling, form of counseling, which even according to labor offices works much better when it's outsourced to private companies. Okay, so we have 4 powiats. This is a middle tier of local government in Poland, responsible for labor market policy. In each powiat, the randomization was separate, and also we have 4 strata in each powiat. Within each strata, there was independent randomization. So we have young and old workers, and we have profile 2 and profile 3 workers. Profile 3 is interesting because these are the most difficult cases, right? So these are the cases when, frankly speaking, when labor offices, they don't know what to do, right? So it was interesting, especially this group was interesting in this case, because we could see if outsourcing services for this, the most challenging group to private entities, could change something. Okay, so an important part here is that we had access to administrative data, which is as I said, is quite difficult, but we got this access through the labor office. So basically they were taking out this data, and after anonymization they were giving it to us. It also shows it's possible why in multiple attempts in Poland, multiple tries, we were told, and our colleagues were told multiple times it's not possible. It seems it is. So we have around 2,000 beneficiaries treatment group in this data, and close to 19,000 of the control group. A lot of work, and Tomasz could probably explain that for hours, how he actually calculated these variables we use as outcomes. It looks very simple now on this graph, but in practice, it's very difficult. And there's one reason for that. And no one in labor offices is using this tool for evaluation. I mean, it's a tool which is used for registering unemployed people, right? And in the moment of registration, it's important you put the data correctly. But later, it's not important because, you know, in the moment, for example, when benefits end or a program ends, no one really cares about this data. There is no reason really to clean it, to analyze that. So that shows also that why the data are there, if they are not used for evaluation, we actually spend 1 year talking to people how to approach this data, how to understand it correctly, how to clean it, because in multiple times, I think the maximum was, Tomasz, I don't know, there were like one unemployed person was registered 4 times on the same day. And we spent like 1 month discussing, is it possible, what it shows, and how to clean it. Anyhow, we have 2 outcome variables, so duration of registered unemployment for over 6, 9, and 12 months, and the share of unemployed in the control and treatment group who registered in labor offices. So we first checked if the randomization was real, because we have serious doubts, but it seems, and Małopolski is a region of people are very serious, and they did it seriously. They really, maybe it's because so close to Slovakia, I don't know, but but they are much more serious about this than in the rest of Poland, about many things. And they checked carefully, they controlled the randomization. We checked whether, you know, different variables like education level, gender, civil status, disability, number of days in the law register is the same across control and treated group. We didn't see any differences. So it was pretty clear that both, because they are also quite large, so it's pretty clear that the 2 groups were assigned random. Here is also, and here is actually a main outcome of the analysis. So first of all, we checked whether the time, the number of days in registered unemployment is the same before intervention, and you can see it's almost identical in 2 groups, which again shows a very nice randomization. And then after the treatment, we see that after 6 months, 9 months, and 12 months, the difference between treated and controls in the number of days in registered unemployment is increasing. So that also shows what is important here, and also showed on this another graph what Celine was saying, that, you know, it's not enough to measure outcomes at some moment in time. You should follow it over time, right? And with administrative data, if it's well linked to, I don't know, social security register and other, you could actually do it over time. And we would love to see how it ended for these people after, let's say, 2-3 years. But for the period that we analyzed, we see pretty positive outcomes. Here are the comparisons between groups, and what is really interesting, I don't want to go into details. I mean, for us, probably, I mean, the youngest are interesting, and we can see that even for the youngest group, there is some impact when you, no, there's actually no difference, but if you, I mean, there is some impact, sorry, for the profile 3 group, right? So the most challenging youth, maybe not that big as for the older ones, but still, I mean, 6% is quite a reduction in the number of people who registered to unemployed. Of course, we don't know, and that's another drawback of this approach. We don't know what really happened to these people. Maybe they went abroad, I don't know, but they didn't come back to the labor office, that's for sure. But for older profile 3 people, you can see a large difference. And now from, you know, it's also important, you know, to conduct RCT, but then to understand the results. And actually, after interviews with people in labor offices, they told us that And with private companies, this was actually from the ministry evaluation report. They told us that many of these people were, for example, people who would work in not legally, who had some vocational education, and what they needed was counseling, talking to them, explaining to them the benefits of registering, for example, and being employed officially, things like that, but also convincing them they can find a job on the labor market and showing them how to do that. We also conducted robustness checks, as Márton was explaining. Even if you have randomized control trial, even if you checked for randomization, then after that, especially when you start comparing different groups, it's nice to check if the key covariates like education, gender, and others are still balanced between treated and control, and if not, then rebalance them. For example, we did it using propensity score matching, and we found it doesn't matter really. Even the results are slightly stronger, but in general, the difference is not statistically significant. So, so the results are robust to these checks. So summing up the results, we show there is a positive impact of this privatized outsourced services, and it was especially strong for the most challenging group of unemployed. So I think very important finding. And in this case, I would say it solved the problem which labor offices were not able to solve for many years. So privatization was actually a solution here, because for many years we saw that these people classified in profile 3 are actually those who couldn't be held by labor offices. For those who receive regular help, so people in profile 2, the results are not clear-cut. Actually, maybe also with a standard, I mean, slightly better results, but not that large as in profile 3. Okay, so just a short discussion of these results. So that was the first RCT evaluation of labor market policies in Poland. Sorry. It actually shows that it is possible, but requires goodwill, right? Requires people who are interested in seeing what is reality. And I'm not blaming people working in labor offices that they'll not conduct this evaluation, because that's not really their main task. I mean, their main task is to support unemployed people, not to collect, research evidence. So it has to be somehow supported by the ministry or by central institutions. Otherwise, it just relies on individuals. What is also important, if you have access to administrative data, it's actually very cheap. I wouldn't say it's not even not expensive. It's very cheap. It's basically you have to collect this data. You have to analyze them, write a report. That's it. And in many cases, what we see in Poland, that are, instead of that, people prefer to run very costly surveys, for example, spend millions of collecting this data, which show us associations, right? It's very difficult to get causal effects from this data. So instead of that, running some RCTs would be a really much more efficient approach. So we have here a causal estimate, and as we can see, compared to hundreds of typical evaluations conducted in Poland, but in other countries, it's worth much more, and it's quite easy to implement. Of course, here a big question, I don't want to go into discussion whether when RCTs are possible or not. Probably we'll have something like that in the future, but of course a big question is here is, can you randomize? And that was a question which we had to discuss with people in labor offices. I have to say we are not successful in convincing labor offices for other programs to run RCTs. And main explanation here is that they cannot select people to participate, right? By law, they are obliged to provide help for everyone. And it's a reasonable explanation. On the other hand, we know that that is a situation in many places, but you can delay that over time, right? And I think we saw a nice example from Miroslav, how you can delay intervention, right, over like 6 months and then compare it, the effects for different cohorts. That also provides you causal estimates, a little bit more complicated, but you can say you are not refusing anyone, and you can then randomize assistance. So there are many issues with that, but in general, I think the message is that it's possible. In most cases, it's just too new. I think that labor officers are not used to that. And our example is actually interesting because the ministry, based on the reports, like I said in the beginning, mostly based on opinions and mostly based on before and after comparison, they said the program didn't work. And they are right in one aspect. What we estimated, and that also a limitation of RCT, is the local effect, right? It worked in this particular setup, in Małopolskie, with this regional office and with these private entities. We are not sure if you would go to other regional offices, it would work again, because maybe they don't have as good private companies. This is what they said, right? In many places, you don't have really very good private employment agencies that could work with you and so difficult, challenging unemployed population. So that, of course, the case, but it's also a lesson what to do to generalize this effect to other regional offices. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maciej, so much for this presentation. Yes, and the terrifying thing is that, in contrary to our RCT, the ministerial evaluation was a study on how not to do evaluation if you want to really drive a reasonable conclusion. So thank you for those amazing 4 presentations during today's webinar, the first webinar of our project. So I think it is a very good start. I don't see many questions, so I have a question, which is a summary of what we have said today. And I will ask the presenters to answer in the order that presentations were ordered, and also I see there is you can, during your final remarks, you can ask other presenters some questions. So my question is, what are your recommendations for our project, for the evaluators and for researchers that are going to work now during the post-COVID reality, during the difficult international situation, when we think of targeting youths and assess the ALMP programs? So what is your summary? I know from all meetings I have, and also teaching students, that prolonging such meetings for more than like 10 or 15 minutes is too much. So kindly please just give us like a 2-3 minute overview of recommendations you have for us as the project consortium. So Márton, you're first.
So thank you very much. I'm not going to dwell on summarizing what I said before. I'm going to raise a slightly bit different point, is that besides thinking about how to evaluate different programs in a good quality way, there's another issue that needs to be highlighted, is that we don't know enough about how individuals are selected into different programs. And we do not know whether the intended objective, or at least declared objectives of many of these programs, are actually reached when they are implemented. For instance, in the so-called reinforced version of the Youth Guarantee, the DG Employment again stresses that the Youth Guarantee ought to target disadvantaged or vulnerable youths, and that public employment services ought to make an effort to reach out to disadvantaged or vulnerable youths. Now, I think it's an important thing to point out that we don't even have evidence on not only whether these programs work, but on whether the public employment services are actually doing what they are asked to do. So we should not forget about also, besides evaluation, to talk about targeting. Whom are the public employment services targeting currently? Because it's an extremely important issue to think about cream skimming, and that will ultimately take us to the question of how to do outreach to vulnerable people, and B, how to incentivize public servants to do their jobs in the way that the policymakers are intending them to do their jobs. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Celine?
Yeah, Tomasz. So I think that, you know, one of the biggest issue that I've seen, and it's not necessarily just thinking about youth employment projects, but employment projects in general, is that when you manage to evaluate them with proper impact evaluation, what you miss very often is the whole integration of how much it costs to bring someone on the labor market. So the whole cost effectiveness analysis. And if I were to think about what I would really want to see is this combination of both, you know, the proper impact evaluation with counterfactual and the integration of, you know, whether the experiment that you ran that was extremely successful but cost, I don't know, 5,000 euros per person brought back on the labor market is really worth it.
Thank you so much, Celine. Very good point. So, Miroslav?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to add on the discussion of cost-benefit effectiveness by underlining how far, I mean, are we from telling the policymaker what to do, because we are asking the question what works, but and produce just you know, some estimates, some you know, coefficients, some percentages, but this is quite far from telling someone to, I mean, about what should be the next step. Yeah, I would like to support this with two examples from the figures I was presenting. So the first was what we've seen that the expensive support is working when it is provided in the earlier stages of the unemployment spell. What does this mean in practice? That you would like to deliver the most intensive support to those who are furthest from the labor market, so those who are least employable, and to do, I mean, to identify these cases, you need some, I mean, you usually need some unemployment spell to be elapsed. Yeah. If you don't have a perfect profiling system operating, I'm sure in Poland you trust your profiling system. We don't trust any because we don't use any. I mean, it's one thing which could actually help in such situations. But I mean, so how would you? I mean, what type of conclusion would you draw out of, you know, these two coefficients? One is saying you have like a 3% bonus if you apply the same support after 6 months, and then the other one is saying that you have like 8% impact if you apply it in the first 6 months. Should the policymaker aim to, you know, identify those cases earlier and try to implement it? And can you imagine the possible scenarios, or the number of possible scenarios how such a recommendation could be implemented? Yeah, so that was one example. And then the second one is simply by which is simply pointing at the how we reduce our outcomes. So if you reduce our outcomes, we always have to reduce them because of the data issues and stuff and other limitations. But then out of our analysis, we see that the public works type of programs are not working at all. I mean, they have either negative coefficients or not significant coefficients. So should we abandon them? Should we stop doing it? Should we stop sending people to these programs? I mean, that would probably not be a wise recommendation either, because one thing is that they have, I mean, various side effects, these programs. They have tradition, they have, let's say, other outcomes which are not captured by the one we were following. And then, yeah, since we are only limiting our attention to the employment chances, our increase of employment chances, then we should not draw recommendation. I mean, I'm not that confident to draw such a strong recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And the final speech from Maciej.
Thank you. So very good comments, and maybe I will not repeat what I said already, but I would like to, you know, refer to what you just said. So as Márton said, I mean, this selection issue to different policies is the most important problem, right? The most important issue. That's why a naive comparisons, which unfortunately are common. I mean, if you look at, you know, I don't know, 1,000 evaluation conducted of labor market policies in Poland, probably in every project or training project, you had some evaluation. All of them provide numbers which are meaningless, because we compare, for example, before and after outcomes, and we know the group was highly selective and things like that. So they actually are, if you ask me, if you should conduct these evaluations or not, I would say maybe just describe the project, describe, provide description, and that's it, because it's not only it doesn't give us knowledge, it actually is misleading, because people who are not trained might believe these numbers are correct. Like in the case of the project we evaluated, people believed that this outsourcing to private companies doesn't work, because there was a big 300 pages report, right, from the ministry. And Celine, I think it was amazing point here, this cost benefit analysis, why also like Miroslav's comments on that. And I think, in our case, it's actually quite easy, right, to calculate, because we know what was the cost of outsourcing that to the private company, and we have a causal effect. So we could do that. But for public labor offices, it's very difficult, because they don't know the costs at all. I mean, even if they calculate it, it's like there are a lot of hidden costs, like they don't take into account they exist, right? And they do the regular jobs. And the impact is of course not measured. So you need to start measuring both. And I agree. On the other hand, what Miroslav said, I think we should stop, thinking about the world like, I have this RCT, like I'm very proud of our research. It shows us the impact will be 17.3%, and we convince everyone that if you implement this approach, you will get the same reduction. Of course, it's totally naive, right? We know that it cannot be generalized to, for example, all regions. It will work very differently with just changing a private company outsourced to do this work. So I think instead of that, I like approach which is unfortunately not often applied in the spirit of Charles Mansky, when you see at possibilities, right? You look at possibilities. You have a range, like you said. It might be from 6 to 8%. What are the chances? And I don't think policymakers, the policymakers are constantly doing such choices. Making, politics and making policy is like choosing, from different options with some probability it will work or not, right? And about the zero impact, if I still may continue, Tomasz, I think, it's a big question, right? Because this is what Miroslav said, and what Celine was also showing, many of the projects, they don't work, right? And we spend billions and billions on them. And I think it's not about, abandoning people not to provide any support, but in many cases of training, I will just give this example because my field is education. In many cases, we see the training for young people is not enough, because what they miss is foundational skills they can learn in regular education. You can't do much if people cannot read, they don't know basic mathematics. They cannot become programmers or whatever the training you provide, right? So maybe, these short-term training programs are not the solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maciej, and thank you for all those summaries. I see also some other questions that appeared on chat. Well, in general, they are very much related to the possibility of linking the data between the registers and those additional challenges that are related to that. Actually, due to time constraint, we need to finish today's webinar, which is the first webinar. But the good news is that there will be a series of webinars during this project. So I hope that during the successive joint events that we will have, we can deepen the discussion. And I learned a lot today. And having such amazing team of experts that support our project, I am sure that this will be really fruitful work. So thank you so much for attending. Thank you all experts and panelists today, and thank you for being here with us and listening to this unique experiences shared by the top researchers worldwide. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tomasz, for
Thanks, bye.
leading it.
Thank you.
Amazing presentation. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.